Today we're going to be replacing the leaf springs on a first generation Toyota 4Runner, the one behind me. Now these trucks always develop these saggy leaf springs over time, and you just basically have to replace them with brand new ones. Let's take a look. So one big characteristic of these first generation 4Runners, especially if they're in the Midwest United States, is that they start to rot away on the body. You can see this one has a ton of rust, but the second characteristic is that they always develop rear end sag because they basically have the stock pickup truck leaf springs, but with the added weight of this removable topper. This thing is just always installed on the vehicle, it weighs quite a bit, and it just puts a lot of wear and tear on those rear springs. So they always tend to have the rear end drooping more than the front, as you can see on this one. And then as you can see, rust and corrosion don't do the springs any benefit either. See how they're pretty flattened out. So we are going to be replacing those springs, changing out the shocks, and doing a couple other things while we're in there. Let's go look at the parts we need to do this job. So there's quite a lot of parts to buy in order to successfully take on replacing the rear leaf springs. It's not simply just buying the leaf springs and calling it good. Now there's a lot of ancillary parts that you have to get, such as hardware and shackles and shocks, to make sure you do this job thoroughly. So just to start off, over here we've got some new shocks. These are just OE replacement Monroes. They were fairly inexpensive and they should last a pretty long time. Definitely better than what's on there, the rusty hulks that are there right now. If you're working on a truck, especially one from the Midwest or in the Northeast or something like that, you can't assume any hardware is going to be reusable. In fact, most hardware you're probably going to have to cut off to get the leaf springs out of there. So knowing that, I bought brand new U-bolts. Had a spring shop locally make these. 4 of them came out to be $45. It comes with new hardware, nuts and washers and all of that. Definitely consider replacing these if you're going to be changing out the leaf springs. So one of the bump stops fell off, and you cannot get the bump stops for these older 4Runners anymore. They are part of the top spring clamp. Once the rubber piece falls off of it, you can't put it back on. So what I'm going to do is try and retrofit a more modern bump stop to the existing spring clamp. So I just purchased these. I think these are for a GMC Sierra / Silverado, something like that. And I'm going to see if I can't weld these to the top of that spring clamp and make my own bump stop retrofit. So over here are new hardware for the front of the springs. I got these straight through Toyota because I wasn't exactly sure what the hardware size would be. And I have a good feeling I'm going to have to cut some of these off because this truck is pretty rusty underneath. So got all new nuts, bolts, and washers for this. Over here are new rear shackles for the springs because again, this truck is very rusty and I don't intend to be able to reuse anything I'm taking off of it. So I picked these up from Trail Gear. These were about $85, but they're really nice. They have greasable bolts in there. They are ½ an inch longer than stock, but it shouldn't make too much of a difference. And of course, the plating on all of them is a lot nicer than stock, and obviously it looks a little heavier duty than stock. As part of the spring replacement, I've got new bushings. So these go into the springs themselves and onto the shackles. These are about $4 or $5 a piece, so just keep that in mind. You probably want to replace these with new while you're doing this. And lastly, of course, are the leaf springs themselves. So there's a lot of suppliers that offer these springs. I really think they're all coming from the same warehouse overseas, but I ended up picking these up from Michigan Truck Spring. They had the best deal with the price of the spring plus shipping to my front door. I think all in it was about $340, which is a great price. Really, if you start looking at aftermarket options or even lift springs or anything like that, none of them are exactly inexpensive, and you're really not sure what you're getting into as far as modifications to other things such as your shackles or your shocks if you do end up going the lift kit way. But if you're replacing them with OEM style, the same height that originally would have been there, then it's all pretty straightforward. You have your standard shocks, your standard shackles, your standard U-bolts, and everything should go back the way they came out. So let's unbox these, see what they look like. These are pretty nice looking springs. They actually come with the bushings here in the front, I believe. So that's one less bushing I will have to replace. So they're nicely coated, got a nice anti-corrosion paint that's been applied. So a complete spring set, ready to go right onto the truck. So you see right there, the part number for them are 90-1 119. Again, that's a pretty universal part number. There's quite a few suppliers of these springs, so you just got to look around and see who has the best price on them. All right, so the first thing we got to do in order to replace these springs is get some jack stands, 4 of them actually, 4 high lift jack stands. So these are 6-ton ones I picked up from Harbor Freight. Really the best things you can get for this sort of job. So what we're gonna do is first support the frame of the vehicle and then support the axle of the vehicle independently. So we'll raise from the axle here, get the body off the ground, put some jack stands underneath the frame, then lower the axle and put some jack stands under that. All right, recap time. So here are all the old parts I took off. You can see lots of rust, lots of corrosion. Old shock surprisingly still has good damping in it, but not for long because this casing is about to rust all the way through. So you should never go into an operation like this, especially if you're in the Midwest area or anywhere that they use salt on the roads in the wintertime. You should never assume you're going to be able to reuse any hardware. That includes the U-bolts, any of the shackle bolts, any of the shock bolts. As you can see right here, the front spring bolt, I had to cut it to get it out because they use a metal insert in the bushing here. The through bolt just fuses to that inner bushing and you will never get that to twist out of there. You will have to cut it. While technically I could reuse the old shackle, I don't think I would want to. I went into this not knowing if I'd be able to even get it off, but I did get it off in one piece, but just look how corroded it is. It doesn't even have the correct shape anymore. So I went out and bought a new heavier duty piece. It's a little bit longer from bolt to bolt. You can see it's about a 1/2 inch longer. It should give it maybe a little bit more ride height, which is a good thing. And these are independent bolts. They're not fused to one of the side plates of the shackle, so it's a much better design. These bolts do have grease nipples on there so you can lubricate the bushings. And the hardware is just heavier duty overall. This shackle kit came with 4 bushings, for the top bolt and the bottom bolt. 1 bolt goes through the frame of the truck, 1 bolt goes through the rear leaf spring. And it turns out the bushings they gave us, 2 of them are the correct size. So these smaller ones go through the frame, but the larger ones they gave us go through the front of the leaf spring, not the rear of the leaf spring. They're too large for the size that they need to go through. So kind of planned on something going wrong, so I ordered extra of these bushings. I'm glad I did because I will need these to put into the rear of the leaf spring. I'm not sure why it comes with the bushings that go into the front of the leaf spring because that's not where the shackle goes. So just keep in mind, if you're buying this shackle kit, you will need to make sure you have 4 of these smaller size bushings before you can mount this up. Now also here is the top spring clamp. So this is what actually secures the leaf spring pack to the axle. So Toyota, the original design Toyota had this rubber bump stop fused to the top of this. And I'm sure it was just kind of melted on top of here, and that's good for about 20 years, but after you pass 30 years it just starts to rust. It'll fall off like this one does. You can see there's no way to remount this to the top of there. It's literally some sort of adhesive or something that holds that on there, and it's never going to really hold up that long anyways. So what I'm going to do is use this aftermarket bump stop, level off the bottom of this so it sits flush on top of this spring mount, and I'm going to weld it to the top of this, and it should serve as a much better design. You can see that it's basically the same height, maybe like 1/2 inch taller or something like that, which is not a big deal. Alright, so here is my new custom built bump stop, and it looks pretty good. Not exactly perfectly centered, but it doesn't really matter. Leaf spring suspension is less than perfect to begin with. Certainly more structurally sound than simply this being glued to the top or whatever Toyota did originally. So you can see overall height of that bump stop is about an inch, maybe half an inch or an inch higher. It'll be fine. I did a quick paint job just to kind of help stave off rust and corrosion for at least a little while. So let's get this mounted back up. I'd say that's looking a bit more level now. Certainly looks really nice underneath. All right. That suspension system looks so good under there. New shocks, bump stops, new shackles with greasable bolts. Looks great. So that suspension system should last a long time. Now, unfortunately, as I was pulling this thing out of the garage to check out the new ride height, it blew a head gasket. The thing ran perfectly since the day we bought it, like 10 years ago, and it just so happens that this particular day, it blew the head gasket. It started spewing white smoke out of the exhaust. I had a nasty misfire, and it's just a really obvious head gasket failure. nasty misfire here at idle. If we look at the exhaust. Yep. Casper the Friendly Ghost has made its way out the tailpipe. It's almost as if this 4Runner knew it was in the best place to have a catastrophic failure, so it just went ahead and did it. Bleh. I'm gonna stay here for a while. Just look at this. Holy crap. That smoke smells like coolant too. So back into the garage we go. Wow. I think that's coolant coming out of the exhaust. That is one hell of a head gasket leak. Just out of nowhere, it failed. It was running perfectly. I wish I could say this is uncommon for the 3-liter Toyota engine, but actually it's very common for these to have head gasket failures. In fact, Toyota had a recall campaign way back when, and they even offer a revised head gasket to install in these things. So that is what we're going to be doing, I guess. I had absolutely no intention of doing a prolonged series on this Toyota 4Runner, but it just so happens to be my dad's truck, and it's here at my house where all the tools are, and it makes no sense to tow it somewhere else just to have it towed back here to be worked on later on. So I'm gonna take on it right now. All my other projects are gonna be delayed so I can get new head gaskets put in this thing so it runs right once again. So sorry if you were hoping to see more videos on the Ducati 1198 soon. Those are probably gonna be delayed at least a month until I can get this thing back up and running. So stay tuned to see head gasket swap on a old Toyota V6 engine. See you then.